Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a signal that echoes through the void of space, bouncing off dead stars and traversing the cold darkness between worlds. It is a simple message, repeated endlessly across millennia, patient as the grave and stubborn as the mountains. 3 words that carry the weight of betrayal, the fire of vengeance, and the unbreakable will of a warrior who refused to be forgotten. The ancient awaits. These words traveled through the warp-touched emptiness of a galaxy torn apart by war, reaching out like fingers of desperate hope to touch whoever might be listening. They found ears that should not have heard them, drew attention from powers that should not have cared, and ultimately set into motion the final chapter of a story 10,000 years in the making. This is the tale of Rylanor, known as the Ancient of Rites. Called by some Rylanor the Unyielding, he was a venerable dreadnought of the Emperor's Children Legion, one of the original Space Marine legions created during humanity's darkest and most hopeful hours. His story spans the breadth of human history in the 31st millennium, from the blood-soaked plains of ancient terror to the ash-choked ruins of a world that saw the birth of the greatest betrayal the galaxy has ever known. He witnessed the rise of an empire that promised to unite all of humanity under one glorious banner. He watched as that empire tore itself apart from within, as brothers turned against brothers and sons raised weapons against their fathers. He survived horrors that would have broken lesser warriors, endured isolation that would have driven saints to madness, and in the end, why he achieved a victory that no battlefield triumph could ever match. Rylanor's story is not merely about war, though war is certainly part of it. It is not simply about loyalty, though loyalty defines every moment of his existence. At its heart, this is a story about what it means to remain true to yourself when everything around you has been corrupted. It is about standing firm when standing firm seems pointless, about refusing to bend when bending would be so much easier. It is about the kind of courage that does not roar with thunder and lightning, but whispers quietly in the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when it can finally make itself heard. To understand Rylanor, we must first understand what he was, this strange and terrible form of existence known as a dreadnought. In the grim darkness of the far future, when a space marine falls in battle but clings to life with a thread too thin for even the most skilled apothecary to preserve, there exists one final option. The warrior's broken body can be interred within the armored sarcophagus of a dreadnought, a walking tomb of adamantium and ceramite that allows the fallen hero to continue his service to the Emperor even beyond the boundaries of mortal flesh. It sounds like salvation. It is spoken of as an honor, the highest tribute that can be paid to a warrior whose deeds have earned him a place among the legends of his chapter or legion. But the reality is far more complex, far more terrible than any honorific could convey. The dreadnought is not simply armor worn by a wounded warrior. It is a coffin that walks, a prison that fights. If the consciousness of the interred marine is kept alive through arcane technologies, suspended in a state between life and death, awakened only when war calls and his brothers have need of his ancient power. Between these moments of violent purpose, the dreadnought sleeps, lost in a void of unconsciousness that can stretch for years, decades, even centuries. Each awakening brings disorientation, the slow realization that time has marched on while you lay frozen in your metal tomb. Faces that were once familiar have aged and died. Comrades whose names you remember as clearly as your own have passed into legend, their deeds recorded in chronicles that you slept through. The world changes around you, but you remain the same, a relic of an age that everyone else has forgotten. Some dreadnoughts embrace this fate, of finding peace in service and purpose in the endless war. Others descend into madness, their minds fractured by the isolation and the slow erosion of everything that once made them human. But Rylanor was neither of these things. He was something else entirely, something that defied the expectations of those who put him in that adamantium shell and the assumptions of those who thought they understood what he had become. He was the ancient of rites, the keeper of ceremonies and traditions, a living connection to the earliest days of his legion. And he was loyal, more loyal than anyone could have imagined, more loyal than even the dark powers that sought to corrupt him could comprehend. His loyalty would be tested in ways that no warrior should ever have to face. It would be betrayed by the very people who should have cherished it most. And in the end, it would burn brighter than any star, a beacon in the darkness that called out across 10,000 years with a message that would shake the foundations of the warp itself. The ancient awaits. Before we begin this journey through time and tragedy, let us take a moment to understand what makes Rylanor's story so extraordinary among the countless tales of heroism and sacrifice that fill the annals of the Imperium. The galaxy is vast beyond comprehension, filled with warriors who have given their lives in service to the Emperor. Billions have died holding the line against the enemies of mankind. Millions have achieved feats of valor that would seem impossible to those who were not there to witness them. Yet Rylanor stands apart from even this exalted company, not because of the battles he won or the enemies he slew, but because of the simple, terrible, magnificent thing he did when everything else had been taken from him. He waited. In a universe where war is constant and death is never more than a heartbeat away, Rylanor waited. He endured 10,000 years of isolation that would have driven any sane being to madness, and when the moment finally came, he did not waver. He did not compromise. He did not bend. He stood before the corrupted god that his Primarch had become and spoke words of rejection that carried more power than any weapon ever forged. This is what makes his story worth telling. This is what makes him the most loyal Dreadnought in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not his combat record, impressive as it was. Not his position of honor within his legion, significant as that might have been. But the simple, stubborn, unbreakable loyalty that burned within him through darkness that seemed eternal. Let us go back then, to the beginning, to a time before the Horus heresy, before the Emperor's children became synonymous with corruption and excess. Let us travel to an age when the Imperium was young and full of promise, when the Space Marine legions were instruments of hope rather than engines of devastation. Let us meet Rylanor as he was in the beginning, a warrior of terror, a son of Europa, a soldier in the army of unification that would one day span the stars. Origins, the birth of a legend. Long before the stars knew the tread of humanity's boots, before the Great Crusade had carried the Emperor's light to the farthest corners of the galaxy, there was terror. It was a world of ashes and ambition, where techno-barbarian warlords carved out petty kingdoms from the ruins of a forgotten golden age, and where the promise of unity seemed like nothing more than the fevered dream of madmen. This was the age of the Unification Wars, when the being who would come to be known as the Emperor of Mankind first emerged from the shadows of history to forge an empire from the scattered remnants of human civilization. It was in this crucible of violence and vision that the Space Marine legions were born. 20 legions, each one created from the genetic template of a Primarch, each one designed to be the Emperor's instrument of conquest and unification. But in these early days, the Primarchs themselves were scattered across the galaxy, stolen from their father's side by the machinations of the ruinous powers and cast upon distant worlds to be raised far from the destiny that awaited them. The legions, then, were led not by their intended masters, but by ordinary men, mortal commanders who guided these superhuman warriors through the blood-soaked campaigns that would bring all of terror under one banner. The Third Legion drew its earliest recruits from the ancient land of Europa, from the courts and bloodlines of techno-aristocratic houses that had bent the knee to the Emperor's rule. These were not conscripts dragged from the gutters of hive cities, not survivors of conquered populations offered a choice between service and extinction. They were volunteers, the finest sons of noble families who saw in the Emperor's vision something worth dying for, something worth becoming more than human to achieve. House Loculus of Comarg was among the first to offer up its youth, selecting the strongest and most promising of its children to undergo the transformation into Astartes. Other houses followed, their pride stung by the thought that rivals might gain influence in the Emperor's new order that they themselves had been denied. Competition bred excellence, and the Third Legion soon numbered among its ranks warriors whose lineage in battle stretched back into the lost ages of old terror. The culture that developed among these early emperors' children was unique among the legions Astartes. Where other legions drew their character from the worlds they recruited from, or the particular doctrines of their primarchs, the Third Legion was shaped by the aristocratic traditions of old terror itself. And they valued refinement alongside strength, culture alongside conquest. They saw themselves not merely as warriors, but as the inheritors of everything humanity had achieved before the darkness of old night descended upon terror. Art, philosophy, music, poetry, all of these were as much a part of their identity as bolter drill and combat tactics. This might seem like weakness to those who knew only war, but it was anything but. The Third Legion understood that they were fighting for something more than mere survival, more than the simple continuation of the human species. They were fighting for civilization itself, for the preservation and advancement of everything that made humanity worth preserving. A warrior who understood why he fought, who knew what he was defending and why it mattered. He was worth 10 who simply followed orders without comprehension. Rylanor came from these first generations of the Third Legion. He was Terran-born, one of the original Astartes created before the Primarchs were found and reunited with their genetic sons. His family records, if any survived the wars that followed, would have shown a lineage of soldiers and scholars, of men and women who had fought and thought their way through the nightmares of old night. What specific bloodline he belonged to has been lost to history, but we know this much. He was present at the beginning, and he was there when the Emperor himself led the legions into battle. Consider what that means for a moment. Rylanor did not simply serve under the Emperor's command in the abstract way that later generations of Space Marines would. He stood on the same battlefields, fought in the same campaigns, and witnessed with his own eyes the master of mankind waging war upon the enemies of human unity. The battle honors etched into his armor in later years would include Roma and Thula, the names of campaigns from the Unification Wars themselves. These were not inherited honors, not marks of distinction passed down from warriors who came before. These were achievements that Rylanor himself had earned, victories that he had helped to win while the Emperor walked among his soldiers as something more than a distant golden figure on a distant golden throne. What did he see in those early battles? What was it like to fight alongside a being whose very presence seemed to reshape reality around him, whose gaze could pierce the secrets of the soul, and whose voice could inspire armies to deeds that defied possibility? Well, we can only imagine, for Rylanor never spoke of these experiences in any record that has survived. Perhaps some memories are too sacred to share, too personal to be reduced to words, or perhaps there are simply no words adequate to describe what it feels like to stand in the presence of a god who has chosen to walk among men. The Third Legion in these early days was small, its numbers limited by the difficulties of the gene seed implantation process and the demands of constant warfare. Unlike some of its brother legions, which could count their members in the hundreds of thousands, the Third struggled to maintain even a fraction of that strength. This was due in large part to a genetic flaw, a blight that affected the gene seed and caused a distressing number of aspirants to reject the implantation process or die during the transformation. The Legion dwindled, and for a time it seemed as though the Third might be the first of the Emperor's great works to fail entirely. But those who survived the flawed gene seed were strong indeed. They were tempered by the knowledge that they had overcome odds that had killed their brothers, hardened by the understanding that their very existence was a victory against impossible circumstances. They developed a culture of excellence, a belief that if they could not match their brother legions in numbers, they would exceed them in quality. Every warrior would be the equal of 10. Every squad would fight with the precision and coordination of a company. Every company would strike with the force of an entire chapter. Rylanor exemplified this philosophy. He rose through the ranks, not through political maneuvering or noble connections, but through sheer competence and unwavering dedication. He learned the arts of war as thoroughly as any warrior in the 3rd Legion, mastering blade and bolter, tactics and strategy. But he also developed skills that set him apart from his battle brothers, abilities that would define his role in the Legion for centuries to come. He became known as one who could see the truth in men's hearts. Not through psychic ability, for Rylanor possessed no such gift, but through observation and insight that bordered on the supernatural. He could watch a warrior speak and know whether the words matched the intention behind them. He could study a face and read the doubts that lurked behind confident eyes. This talent made him invaluable in the Legion's recruitment and training processes, for he could identify which aspirants possessed the character to become true Emperor's children, and which carried flaws that would manifest in failure when the moment of crisis arrived. When the Emperor finally reunited the 3rd Legion with its Primarch, Rylanor was among those who witnessed the meeting. Fulgrim had been found on Chemos, a dying world of industrial decay, where he had risen from poverty to become the greatest leader his people had ever known. He transformed that world from a place of slow starvation and grinding despair into something approaching prosperity, all through the sheer force of his will and the brilliance of his vision. Ed, the Emperor, saw in Fulgrim a son worthy of the genetic legacy he carried, and he presented the Primarch to the 3rd Legion with words that would echo through the centuries. The reunion was a moment of profound significance for everyone present. For decades, the 3rd Legion had fought without knowing their true purpose, without understanding the genetic destiny that had been woven into their very being. They knew that somewhere in the galaxy, a Primarch waited for them, a being who carried the template from which their superhuman abilities had been derived. But knowledge and experience are different things, and nothing could have prepared them for the reality of standing in Fulgrim's presence. He was magnificent. Even among the Primarchs, even among beings who were each designed to be the pinnacle of human potential, our Fulgrim stood out as something special. His features were perfect in a way that seemed almost impossible, as if a master sculptor had spent centuries refining every angle and curve, until nothing remained but pure, aesthetic harmony. His voice was music given form, his movements poetry made physical. When he spoke, warriors who had faced horrors that would break ordinary men found themselves moved to tears by the beauty of his words. For the 3rd Legion, finding their Primarch was like coming home after a long exile. They had always known they were missing something, had always sensed that their existence was incomplete in some fundamental way. Now that missing piece was found, and everything made sense. Their drive for perfection, their appreciation for beauty, their need to be the best at everything they attempted, all of these traits found their ultimate expression in the being who now stood before them as their Lord and Father. The 3rd Legion was renamed in that moment. They were no longer simply the 3rd, an anonymous number among 20. They became the Emperor's children, the only legion permitted to bear the Emperor's own name, the only warriors granted the honor of carrying the Palatine Aquila, the Emperor's personal symbol, into battle. And Rylanor, veteran of the Unification Wars and keeper of the Legion's developing traditions, was chosen to be the first of his brothers to carry that sacred standard. Imagine the weight of that honor. Imagine being selected from among all the warriors of your legion to bear the symbol of the Emperor himself, to carry into battle the icon that represented everything humanity was fighting for. Rylanor carried the Palatine Aquila for years, through campaigns that would become legendary in the annals of the Great Crusade. He fought at Fulgrim's side as the Emperor's children proved themselves the equal of any legion, their small numbers compensated for by the ferocity and precision of their attacks. But time takes its toll on all warriors, even those as mighty as the Astartes. The gene enhancements that made Space Marines superior to ordinary humans could not make them immortal, and the constant warfare of the Great Crusade ground down even the most resilient of fighters. Rylanor had been fighting for longer than most of his brothers could remember, his service stretching back to an era that many considered more myth than history. When he fell in battle against the Eldari, he grievously wounded beyond the ability of the Legion's apothecaries to restore him to his former glory. A decision had to be made. The mortal wound and internment. The Eldari are ancient, beyond human comprehension, a race whose civilization spanned the stars, while humanity was still learning to chip flint into tools. They are masters of warfare in ways that make the most sophisticated human tactics look like the clumsy flailing of children, their speed and precision refined over millions of years of existence. To face them in battle is to face death wearing a mask of terrible beauty, to feel the kiss of monomolecular blades that slice through ceramite as easily as through flesh. Rylanor's final battle, as a being of flesh and blood, came during a campaign against these ancient enemies, as somewhere in the vast expanses of space that the Great Crusade was slowly bringing under Imperial control. The specifics of the engagement have been lost to time, the records either destroyed in the wars that followed or sealed away in archives that no longer exist. What we know is that he fought with the same courage and skill that had defined his entire career, that he accounted for many of the alien warriors who faced him, and that in the end, the Eldari managed to do what countless previous enemies had failed to accomplish. They broke him, not his spirit, never that, but his body. The mortal shell that had carried him through centuries of warfare was damaged beyond any possibility of restoration. Wounds that would have killed an ordinary human 100 times over left him hovering on the edge of death, and his twin hearts struggling to pump blood through a cardiovascular system that had been torn apart by alien weapons. The apothecaries who came to him could do nothing but prepare him for the end, for the honored death that awaited a warrior who had served so long and so faithfully. But the Legion had other plans. Rylanor was too valuable to lose entirely, too connected to the traditions and history of the Emperor's children to simply be allowed to pass into the void. His knowledge of the Legion's rites and ceremonies, his ability to perceive truth in the hearts of men, his living memory of the Unification Wars, and the days when the Emperor himself walked among his soldiers, all of these would be lost if he were permitted to die. And so the decision was made to preserve him in the only way possible. It's the Contemptor pattern. Dreadnought was the most advanced of its kind in the arsenal of the Legion's Astartes. It was larger and more powerful than the standard Dreadnought designs that would become common in later millennia, equipped with systems that merged the biological with the mechanical in ways that approached the secrets of the Mechanicum's most arcane lore. At its heart was an atomantic reactor, a power source that could fuel not only the Dreadnought's formidable weapons, but also sophisticated defensive energy fields that gave it protection far beyond what its armor alone could provide. The machine was faster than its bulk suggested, more agile than anything its size had any right to be, and devastating in both ranged and close combat. Into this walking fortress, the remains of Rylanor were placed. His ruined body was removed from what remained of his power armor and installed within the life-sustaining sarcophagus at the Dreadnought's core. Systems that he could not have named or understood took over the functions that his broken organs could no longer perform, keeping his brain alive, keeping his consciousness intact, bridging the gap between the flesh that remained and the metal that now served as his body. When he awoke, he found himself looking out at the world through optical sensors rather than eyes, moving through it on mechanical legs rather than his own, reaching out to touch it with weapons rather than hands. The first moments of consciousness in a dreadnought are said to be among the most disorienting experiences that any being can endure. The warrior wakes expecting to feel the familiar sensations of their own body, but the weight of their limbs, the rhythm of their heartbeat, the flow of air through their lungs. Instead, they find themselves adrift in a sea of data, receiving information about their surroundings through sensors that translate the world into numbers and readings rather than direct experience. Where there should be the warmth of blood circulating through their veins, there is the cold hum of power conduits. Where there should be the subtle feedback of muscles responding to mental commands, there is the mechanical precision of servo motors and hydraulic systems. The body they have known for centuries is gone, replaced by a machine that responds to their thoughts but does not feel like their own flesh ever did. Some warriors scream when they first awaken in their new forms, as their minds rebelling against the fundamental wrongness of their situation. Others retreat into catatonia, unable to process the transformation they have undergone. A few embrace their new existence immediately, their devotion to duty overriding any personal distress they might feel. But even for these stalwart souls, there is a period of adjustment, a time when the warrior must learn to be something other than what they have always been. The transition was not easy. No transition to Dreadnought existence ever is. Warriors who were once among the strongest and fastest of their kind must adapt to a new way of experiencing reality, must learn to interpret the data streams that replace their senses, and to control limbs that respond to thought but do not feel. Some Dreadnoughts never fully adjust, with their minds struggling forever against the alien nature of their new forms. Others adapt too well, losing themselves in the machine and becoming something that is neither man nor device, but a disturbing fusion of both. Rylanor, characteristically, took a middle path. He accepted his new existence without complaint, recognizing it for what it was, an opportunity to continue serving his legion and his emperor in ways that would otherwise have been denied to him. But he did not surrender his humanity to the machine, did not allow the cold logic of systems and processes to replace the warmth of brotherhood and loyalty that had defined his life. He was still Rylanor, still the keeper of traditions and the perceiver of truth. The form had changed, but the essence remained. The Legion recognized this. Rather than relegating him to the status of a mere weapon to be deployed and then forgotten between battles, they gave him a role that suited his unique combination of ancient wisdom and continued service. He became the Ancient of Rites, the official guardian of the Emperor's children's ceremonies and traditions. He presided over the induction of new recruits, watching each aspirant with the same discerning gaze that had always allowed him to see beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath. He maintained the Hall of Rites aboard the Legion's flagship, the Andronius, ensuring that the customs which bound the Emperor's children together were observed with proper reverence. It was a position of tremendous influence, even if it lacked the direct command authority of a captain or the strategic importance of a Legion master. Yet the warriors who passed through Rylanor's scrutiny went on to lead companies and chapters, to command fleets and conquer worlds. They remembered the towering figure of the Dreadnought, who had questioned them about their intentions and their values, who had looked into their souls and judged whether they were worthy of the title Emperor's Children. Many sought his counsel in later years, returning to him for guidance when they faced decisions that tested their honor or challenged their understanding of what it meant to serve. Fulgrim himself valued Rylanor's perspective, including the Ancient of Rites among his honor guard by tradition, if not by strict military necessity. The Primarch understood that his legion's identity was built on more than just martial excellence, or that the culture of perfectionism and honor that set the Emperor's children apart required constant cultivation and care. Rylanor was the embodiment of that culture, a living link to the days when the Legion had earned its unique distinction. His presence in Fulgrim's inner circle was a reminder of where they had come from and what they were meant to be. For decades, this arrangement served the Legion well. The Emperor's children continued their campaigns across the galaxy, bringing world after world into compliance with the Imperium's rule. Their reputation for both combat effectiveness and cultural sophistication grew, their purple and gold banners flying over conquered cities on 100 different planets. And through it all, Rylanor watched and remembered, as preserved in his adamantium shell, while the Legion he loved marched toward a future that none of them could have predicted. But something was changing, slowly at first, so gradually that even Rylanor's keen perception could not quite identify what was different. The character of the Emperor's children began to shift. The perfectionism that had once driven them to excellence began to curdle into something darker, something obsessive and unhealthy. Warriors who had always striven to improve themselves started to exhibit signs of dissatisfaction that went beyond the healthy desire for growth, a gnawing hunger that could never be satisfied no matter how much they achieved. Rylanor noticed these changes. He noted them in the reports he prepared for those who sought his counsel, highlighted them in his assessments of new recruits. Oh, but he could not identify the source, could not point to any single incident or individual as the cause of the slow corruption that was seeping through his beloved legion. He did not know, could not know, that the rot had begun at the very top, in the heart of the Primarch himself. The seeds of corruption. Lyran. The world designated 28-3 in the records of the 28th Expeditionary Fleet was known to its inhabitants as Lyran. It was a water world, its surface covered almost entirely by vast oceans from which rose islands of coral and crystal that seemed to glow with an inner light. The native species, the Leia, were serpentine beings of remarkable sophistication, their civilization built upon principles that defied easy human understanding. They had mastered genetic engineering to a degree that made even the Mechanicum's Magos biologists envious, shaping their own bodies to serve whatever purpose they desired. The administratum officials who assessed Lyran recommended against military action. The Leia were too numerous, too well defended, too deeply entrenched in their watery fortress homes. Any campaign to bring them into compliance would take years, perhaps decades, and would cost more in resources and lives than the planet could possibly be worth. Better to bypass this system, they argued, and return to it later when more forces were available. Fulgrim disagreed. The Primarch saw in Lyran not an obstacle but an opportunity, a chance to prove that the Emperor's children could accomplish what others deemed impossible. He ordered the assault, on committing his legion to a campaign that would test their capabilities to the absolute limit. And they rose to the challenge. In a feat of arms that would become legendary, the Emperor's children conquered Lyran in a single month, crushing the Leia resistance and exterminating the alien species in a display of martial excellence that shocked even their brother legions. Rylanor fought in that campaign, his Dreadnought form wading through the shallows of Lyran's seas and smashing apart the coral fortresses that the Leia had thought impregnable. He witnessed the fury of his battle brothers as they threw themselves at impossible odds and emerged victorious, their purple armor stained with alien blood and their voices raised in songs of triumph. It should have been a moment of supreme pride, and a validation of everything the Emperor's children believed about themselves. But something else happened on Lyran, something that would not reveal its true significance until much later.
I've covered a lot of stories on this channel, but Rylanor hits different for me personally. There's something about a character who just refuses to quit that I find genuinely inspiring. Like, we all have moments where giving up feels like the logical choice, right? Where the easier path is just to let go. But Rylanor sat in the dark for 10,000 years, powered by nothing but spite and principle. That's not just stubbornness, that's conviction. And honestly, in a setting as bleak as 40k, where everything is corruption and decay, having one guy who simply says no and means it forever, that's the kind of hope that Grimdark needs. Anyway, back to the story.
In the ruins of a temple dedicated to powers that the Imperium would have recognized as profoundly dangerous, Fulgrim discovered an artifact that called to him with irresistible allure. It was a sword, beautiful beyond description, its blade gleaming with a silver light that seemed to shift and dance like living mercury. The Primarch was a collector of exquisite objects, a connoisseur of beauty in all its forms. He could not resist taking this masterpiece for his own. What Fulgrim did not know, what he could not have known without the kind of specialized knowledge that was forbidden under the Imperium's secular doctrines, was that the sword was no mere weapon. It was a demon blade, a physical anchor for a warp entity of tremendous power, a servant of the chaos god Slaanesh, who had been worshipped by the Leia as their patron and protector. The blade's beauty was a trap, its elegance a lie, concealing the spiritual poison that lurked within. From the moment Fulgrim's hand closed around its hilt, the corruption of chaos had found a vector into the heart of the Emperor's children. The demon within the blade was patient. It had waited for centuries, perhaps millennia, for a host worthy of its attentions. The Lair had been useful servants, but they were limited by their alien nature, unable to achieve the heights of corruption that the Prince of Pleasure desired. Fulgrim was different. He was a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, a being of immense psychic and physical potential. If the demon could corrupt him, it would deal a blow to the Imperium that would echo through the ages. And so it began its work, carefully, subtly, in ways that even Fulgrim's superhuman intellect could not detect. It whispered to him in his dreams, showing him visions of perfection that exceeded anything he had ever imagined. It fed his insecurities, pointing out flaws in his work that only the demon's supernatural senses could perceive. It stoked his ego, assuring him that he was destined for greatness beyond what the Emperor's restrictive vision could encompass. Little by little, it reshaped his thinking, turning his noble pursuit of excellence into a hunger that could never be satisfied. The changes began subtly, so gradually that they seemed like nothing more than the natural evolution of the Legion's character. Fulgrim became more demanding in his pursuit of perfection, less tolerant of the imperfections he perceived in himself and others. His artistic endeavors, once a source of joy and creative expression, became obsessions that consumed him for days at a time. His mood swung between euphoric confidence and bitter self-criticism, his temper growing shorter even as his charm became more intoxicating. The Legion followed where their Primarch led. Warriors who had always striven for excellence began to exhibit signs of genuine obsession, unable to rest until every aspect of their performance met impossibly high standards. The culture of mutual support and brotherhood that had characterized the Emperor's children began to fray, replaced by competition that bordered on the cutthroat. Beauty and sensation became ends in themselves rather than byproducts of honorable service, and the line between artistic appreciation and hedonistic indulgence grew increasingly blurred. Rylanor watched these changes with growing unease. As the Ancient of Rites, he was responsible for maintaining the traditions that defined the Emperor's children's identity, and he could see those traditions being slowly corrupted. New recruits came to him exhibiting attitudes that would have been considered unacceptable in previous generations, focusing on personal glory rather than collective achievement, seeking sensation rather than satisfaction. When he raised concerns with his superiors, he was told that the Legion was simply evolving, adapting to the changing circumstances of the Great Crusade. His warnings were noted and then ignored. The demon blade worked its corruption on Fulgrim in ways both obvious and subtle. It whispered to him in his private moments, feeding his insecurities and amplifying his doubts. It showed him visions of what he could become if only he would reach for more, if only he would allow himself to pursue perfection without the constraints that duty and honor imposed. And gradually, inevitably, the Primarch began to listen. He began to believe that the Emperor's restrictions on his potential were limitations rather than guidelines, obstacles to be overcome rather than boundaries to be respected. The Farseer Eldrad Ulthran of the Eldari craft world. Ulthwi attempted to warn Fulgrim of the trap he was walking into. Yet in a meeting that should have changed the course of history, the ancient seer revealed the true nature of the demon blade and warned the Primarch that his closest friend and confidant, the Warmaster Horus, was falling to darkness. But the demon's whispers had already taken root too deeply. Fulgrim rejected the warning, attacked the Farseer, and turned away from the last chance he would have to save himself and his legion. When Horus fell to the corruption of chaos on the moon of Darwin, Fulgrim was one of the first Primarchs he approached about his plans for rebellion. The Warmaster played to his brother's vanity and ambition, promising him that under Chaos's patronage, the Emperor's children could achieve the true perfection that the Emperor's small-minded vision had always denied them. Fulgrim, already weakened by the Demon Blade's influence, was convinced with disturbing ease. He brought his legion into Horus's conspiracy, not through force or deception, but through the corruption of their own ideals. Not every Emperor's child accepted this new direction. There were those within the legion who recognized that something had gone terribly wrong, who saw the changes in their Primarch and their battle brothers for what they truly were. These loyalists were not stupid enough to voice their concerns openly, for Fulgrim and his inner circle had become adept at identifying and eliminating potential dissenters. But they watched and waited, hoping against hope that somehow the legion they loved could be saved from the path it was walking. Rylanor was among these troubled souls. His position as Ancient of Rites gave him insight into the legion's evolving culture, and what he saw disturbed him profoundly. The traditions he was supposed to maintain were being twisted into mockeries of themselves. The ceremonies of honor and duty transformed into rituals that celebrated excess and self-indulgence. He spoke privately with Fulgrim on more than one occasion, expressing his concerns in the diplomatic language that long service had taught him. The Primarch listened politely, assured him that all was well, and did nothing to address the issues Rylanor had raised. The Ancient of Rites began to fear that the Legion was lost, that the corruption had spread too far to be reversed. But he could not bring himself to act on that fear, could not imagine raising his hand against the brothers he had served alongside for centuries. As he was loyal, more loyal than perhaps even he understood, and that loyalty bound him to the Emperor's children, even as he watched them transform into something he could no longer recognize. Then came the word that changed everything. The 28th Expeditionary Fleet was being diverted to the Isstvan system, where a rebellion against Imperial authority required the attentions of multiple legions. The Emperor's children would fight alongside the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard, crushing the insurgents and restoring order to the troubled region. It seemed like a routine assignment, the kind of pacification operation that the legions had conducted hundreds of times before. But Rylanor sensed that something was different about this deployment. The warriors selected for the initial assault wave were not chosen based on tactical necessity, but on some other criteria that he could not identify. Officers who had shown any hint of doubt about the Legion's direction were included, while those who had most enthusiastically embraced the changes were held back. Lord Commander Eidolon, who never missed an opportunity to lead a glorious assault, had mysteriously declined to participate in this one, delegating the honor to others. It was Captain Sol Tarvitz who approached Rylanor with a proposition that would determine the Ancient's fate. Tarvitz was one of the Loyalists, a warrior who had proven his worth through countless campaigns, but who shared Rylanor's unease about what the Legion was becoming. He had been assigned to lead the assault on Isstvan III, but he suspected that something was wrong, that the deployment was part of some larger scheme that he did not yet understand. The Gathering Storm. Captain Sol Tarvitz was not a typical Emperor's child, at least not by the standards that had come to define the Legion in those troubled days. He did not hunger for advancement or obsess over personal glory. He did not pursue perfection with the manic intensity that characterized so many of his battle brothers. Instead, he was content to be what he had always been, a competent line officer, a dependable warrior, a marine who did his duty without complaint and did it well. In a legion that had grown increasingly enamored with exceptionalism, Tarvitz stood out precisely because he did not try to stand out. This made him suspicious. In the politics of the corrupted Emperor's children, where personal ambition was the currency of advancement, and where standing still was tantamount to falling behind, Tarvitz's lack of political maneuvering marked him as either dangerously naive or cleverly subversive. Eidolon, the Lord Commander who despised mediocrity in all its forms, had repeatedly passed him over for promotion and assignments that might have brought him glory. But Tarvitz did not seem to care. and this indifference only deepened the suspicion that surrounded him. When the deployment orders for Isstvan III were issued, Tarvitz found himself in an unexpected position. Eidolon, who normally would have fought tooth and nail for the honor of leading the assault, had instead assigned that privilege to Tarvitz. It was a break from every pattern that the captain had observed in his years of service, and it triggered every warning instinct he possessed. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He sought out Rylanor in the Hall of Rites, approaching the towering Dreadnought with a proposal that was as unorthodox as it was dangerous. Tarvitz wanted to remain aboard the fleet while the assault on Isstvan proceeded, wanted to be in a position where he could observe what the commanders were planning and perhaps learn what scheme was being hatched. But he could not simply refuse his assignment, could not explain his suspicions to superiors who might well be part of whatever conspiracy was underway. Would Rylanor take his place? The Ancient of Rites had the authority to assign himself to any combat operation he deemed necessary, and his participation in the assault would raise no eyebrows. And if Rylanor went down to the surface in Tarvitz's stead, the captain could remain on the fleet and investigate his suspicions without arousing the scrutiny that his absence would otherwise bring. It was a risk for both of them. If Tarvitz's fears proved groundless, they would both look foolish for the deception. If his fears proved justified, they would both be in grave danger from forces that had shown themselves willing to eliminate anyone who threatened their plans. But Rylanor recognized in Tarvitz the same qualities that had made the captain a target in the first place: honesty, loyalty, and a refusal to compromise with corruption, even when compromise would have been the safer path. The Ancient of Rites agreed. He would take Tarvitz's place in the assault. It would fight alongside the warriors who had been selected for this questionable honor, and Tarvitz would remain above, watching and waiting, ready to act if his suspicions proved correct. Neither of them could have known how justified those suspicions would prove to be. Neither could have imagined the scope of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The initial assault on Isstvan III proceeded according to plan, at least as far as the Marines on the ground could tell. They swept across the surface of the world, engaging the rebel forces with the coordinated precision that was the Emperor's children's hallmark. The World Eaters provided the shock assault, their berserker fury breaking enemy formations. The Death Guard advanced with implacable determination, soaking up punishment that would have shattered lesser forces. The Sons of Horus operated with the tactical flexibility that had made them the War Master's chosen instrument. Rylanor fought among them, his assault cannon roaring its defiance as he waded through the rebel defenses. His power fist crushed fortifications and vehicles with equal ease, his adamantium hull shrugging off fire that would have killed unarmored warriors instantly. He was doing what he had been preserved to do, serving the Legion and the Imperium through the application of overwhelming force. And yet, even in the midst of battle, even with threats pressing in from all sides, he could not shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. The answer came not from the battlefield, but from the sky above it. Tarvitz, who had remained aboard the fleet as planned, and had discovered the truth that Rylanor and the others on the ground could not have suspected. The assault on Isstvan III was not a legitimate military operation. It was an execution, a purge designed to eliminate all the warriors in the traitor legions who might not accept Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. The soldiers on the surface had been selected not for their military value, but for their suspected loyalty. Every Marine who had shown even the slightest hesitation about the Legion's new direction, every warrior who had questioned the changes in their Primarch's behavior, every officer who had failed to embrace the corruption with sufficient enthusiasm, they had all been gathered together in one place. And now, with the loyal elements of 4 legions concentrated on a single world, Horus was preparing to eliminate them all in one apocalyptic stroke: virus bombs. The War Master's fleet was preparing to deploy the Life Eater, one of the most terrible weapons in the Imperial arsenal. The virus would destroy all organic matter on the planet's surface within seconds, reducing flesh and bone to putrid sludge while leaving structures and equipment intact for later salvage. Everyone on Isstvan III, loyalist and rebel alike, was about to die in agony as their bodies dissolved from within. Tarvitz did the only thing he could do. He seized a Thunderhawk gunship and flew down to the surface himself, racing against time to warn the Loyalists of the doom that was descending upon them. Along the way, he managed to contact Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, another loyal warrior who was aboard a ship that contained both traitors and those still faithful to the Emperor. Garrow would do his part, seizing his vessel and fleeing the system to carry word of the betrayal to Terra. But Tarvitz's mission was not escape. It was salvation, however limited. He reached the surface and spread the word as quickly as he could, warning the Loyalists to seek shelter underground, to seal themselves in bunkers and catacombs that might protect them from the Life Eater's deadly touch. Not everyone could be reached in time. Not everyone believed the seemingly impossible claims of this captain who appeared out of nowhere with tales of betrayal and doom. But those who heeded his warning, those who found shelter before the virus fell, would survive to fight another day. The betrayal at Isstvan III, the sky burned. It was not fire that fell from the heavens, but something far worse, a rain of biological destruction that turned the atmosphere itself into a weapon of mass extinction. The Life Eater virus spread across Isstvan III with terrifying speed, consuming everything it touched with a voracity that defied natural processes. Plants withered and collapsed into oozing masses of decay. Animals died screaming as their tissues liquefied. The rebel population that had dared to defy the War Master's authority ceased to exist in the time it would take to draw a breath, their bodies reduced to organic slurry that seeped across the streets of their cities. The Space Marines who had been caught in the open died as well, though their enhanced physiologies bought them a few seconds more than the ordinary humans around them. But those seconds were long enough to understand what was happening, long enough to realize that they had been betrayed by their own brothers, long enough to feel the horror of dissolution as their superhuman bodies failed them at last. But not all of them died. Thanks to Tarvitz's warning, thousands of Loyalist Marines had managed to reach shelter before the virus struck. They huddled in bunkers and catacombs, their armor seals locked tight, listening to the hideous sounds of apocalypse unfolding above them. They heard the death screams of billions of people dying all at once, a psychic shriek of agony so intense that it was said to be heard as far away as Terra. They felt the ground shake as the firestorm that followed the virus bombing ignited the organic sludge that now covered the planet's surface, a secondary cataclysm that was intended to ensure no survivors. And when the flames died down and the radiation levels dropped to something approaching survivable, they emerged from their hiding places to discover a world transformed into a wasteland of ash and ruin. Rylanor was among the survivors. His Dreadnought shell had protected him from the worst effects of the virus, and he had been guided to shelter by the same instincts that had kept him alive through centuries of warfare. When he climbed out of the bunker that had saved him, his optical sensors showed him a landscape that looked more like a vision of hell than any world he had known. The cities that had stood proud against the rebel forces were now skeletal frameworks of melted metal and collapsed stone, or the air was thick with ash and the stench of decay that the Life Eater left in its wake. But he was not alone. All around him, other survivors were emerging from whatever protection they had found, their purple armor streaked with grime, and their faces marked by the shock of what they had experienced. World Eaters, Death Guard, Sons of Horus, Emperor's Children, warriors from 4 different legions who had been marked for death by their own Primarchs, now stood together on the burned soil of Isstvan III. They were the betrayed, the expendable, the loyal sons who had been deemed too dangerous to live, and they were angry. Captain Tarvitz took command with a natural authority that even Marines from other legions respected. He had warned them, he had saved them, and now he organized them into a fighting force that would make their traitorous brothers pay dearly for the genocide they had attempted. Fortifications were established using the rubble of destroyed buildings. Supply caches were located and distributed among the survivors. Communication networks were established, allowing the scattered groups of loyalists to coordinate their activities. Rylanor became a rallying point for the defense. His towering form could be seen from great distances, and his presence inspired the Loyalists with the same courage that had once characterized the Emperor's children at their best. He fought in the front lines of every engagement, his assault cannon mowing down traitors who had once been his brothers, his power fist crushing the skulls of warriors he had known by name. There was no joy in this killing, and no satisfaction in vengeance. There was only duty, the same duty that had defined his entire existence, to serve the Emperor and destroy his enemies. The battles that raged across Isstvan III were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. For the first time in the history of the Legion as Astartes, Space Marines fought Space Marines not as a training exercise, but with genuine intent to kill. Brother faced brother across no man's lands that were littered with the bodies of warriors who had stood shoulder to shoulder mere weeks before. The weapons that had been designed to destroy alien empires and purge Xeno's worlds were now turned upon fellow humans, and the results were catastrophic. The Loyalists had certain advantages. They were fighting defensively, which allowed them to choose their ground and prepare fortifications. They were motivated by the knowledge that they had been betrayed, a burning rage that pushed them to feats of desperate courage, and they had nothing left to lose, which made them dangerous in ways that warriors who still hoped to survive could never match. But the traitors had advantages of their own. They outnumbered the Loyalists significantly, despite the losses inflicted by the initial resistance. They controlled the orbital assets, which meant they could call down bombardments on any position they could not take by direct assault. And they had their Primarchs with them, beings of such power that their presence alone could turn the tide of battle. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, was particularly active in the fighting. The Red Angel, as he was sometimes called, had never been content to direct battles from behind the lines. He waded into combat personally, his chain axes screaming as they carved through Loyalist defenders with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. Where Angron went, death followed, and the Loyalists learned to withdraw rather than face the Berserker Primarch directly. The traitors had expected the virus bombing to eliminate the Loyalist problem quickly and cleanly. Instead, they found themselves bogged down in a ground war against opponents who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Horus was forced to commit troops to the surface, sending wave after wave of reinforcements to overwhelm the survivors who refused to die quietly. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, threw himself into the fighting personally, his chain axes screaming for blood as he led his berserkers against the defensive positions. But the battle dragged on for weeks, then months. The Loyalists inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers, their desperate fury matched against the overwhelming resources of the traitor legions. For every defender who fell, they took 5, 10, sometimes 20 of their enemies with them. The ashes of Isstvan III were watered with the blood of Astartes, and the war that was supposed to be over before it began had become a protracted nightmare that delayed Horus's timetable by precious weeks. During this time, Rylanor made a vow. He stood among the ruins of what had once been a cathedral to the imperial truth, surrounded by the bodies of traitors he had just slain, and he spoke words that would echo through 10,000 years of isolation. He would have his revenge on Fulgrim, and not on the traitor Marines who followed the corrupted Primarch, not on Horus or the other rebel leaders, but on Fulgrim specifically. The Primarch had made the Emperor's children what they were. He had shaped them, molded them, led them to glory after glory, and then he had betrayed everything they stood for, corrupted the Legion beyond recognition, and ordered the murder of his own sons simply because they remained loyal to the oaths they had sworn. For this, Fulgrim would pay. Rylanor did not know how or when, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would find a way to make his former gene-father answer for his crimes. The final assault came when Horus decided he had wasted enough time on the survivors of Isstvan III. Orbital bombardment reduced the last Loyalist strongholds to rubble, and the remaining defenders were overwhelmed by forces they could no longer resist. Tarvitz fell in the final battle, his body never recovered from the ashes that buried him. The other loyalist leaders died around him, their names preserved only in the memories of those few who escaped. But Rylanor did not die. In the chaos of the final bombardment, he made his way to a location that Tarvitz had mentioned in passing, an underground hangar that might still contain functional spacecraft. His damaged legs barely functioned, his weapons systems were failing, and his power reserves were critically low. But he pushed forward with the same determination that had carried him through every trial of his long existence. He found the hangar, he found the ship, he found something else as well, of something that would become the instrument of his revenge. An unexploded virus bomb, its warhead intact despite the violence that had raged around it. The life eater that had been meant to kill him would become the weapon with which he would strike back at those who had ordered his death. But the ship was destroyed. As he reached it, a squad of noise marines, the corrupted warriors who would become the shock troops of Slaanesh's favored legion, caught up with him. They attacked with sonic weapons that screamed with discordant harmonies, blasts of sound so intense that they could shatter ceramite and pulverize flesh. Rylanor killed them all, his failing systems pushed beyond their limits by the rage that burned within him. But in the process, the ship was damaged beyond any hope of repair. He was trapped, stranded on a dead world, his mobility destroyed, his systems failing, with no hope of rescue and no way to escape. The last of the Loyalist Emperor's children, alone with an unexploded bomb and a hatred that would sustain him through darkness beyond imagining. 10,000 years of waiting silence. For 10,000 years, silence. Try to imagine it. Try to wrap your mind around a span of time so vast that civilizations rise and fall within it, like waves breaking upon a shore. 10,000 years ago, humanity was just beginning to discover the principles that would lead to civilization. 10,000 years encompasses the entirety of recorded human history before the age of the Imperium. And Rylanor spent all of that time alone, trapped in a ruined hangar on a dead world, with nothing but his hatred and his memories for company. The first centuries must have been the hardest. His systems were still relatively functional then, his mind still sharp with the memories of what had been and the rage at what had been done. He replayed the betrayal over and over, analyzing every moment, searching for signs he might have missed, warnings he could have heeded. He composed speeches in his mind, words he would speak to Fulgrim when the moment came, accusations and condemnations that he refined and perfected during the endless darkness. He thought about his brothers who had died, both those who had remained loyal and those who had embraced corruption. He remembered faces that would never be seen again, voices that would never speak, deeds that would never be performed. The Emperor's children had been his family for longer than most human civilizations had existed. And now that family was either dead or transformed into something monstrous, the grief was overwhelming at times, a weight that threatened to crush whatever remained of his spirit. The ash settled and hardened into a crust that covered everything. The radiation faded to levels that would still be lethal to unprotected humans, but posed no threat to the ancient warrior entombed in his adamantium shell. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, marking the passage of centuries, while the lone survivor of the Isstvan III atrocity remained motionless in his underground prison. Rylanor's power reserves dwindled, his systems cycled down to minimum functionality, preserving only those processes absolutely necessary to keep his consciousness intact. The assault cannon that had spoken death to so many enemies fell silent, while its ammunition depleted and its mechanism seized by neglect. The power fist that had crushed traitor skulls hung limp at his side, its energy cells exhausted beyond recovery. The optical sensors that had surveyed 100 battlefields dimmed to the point where they could barely detect the walls of the hangar around him. But he did not die. He could not die. The sarcophagus that held his ruined flesh continued to function, its ancient technologies sustaining the spark of life that refused to be extinguished. His consciousness remained intact, a prisoner in a tomb within a tomb, alone with his memories and his rage and the unbreakable will that kept him from surrendering to the void. Most beings would have gone mad. 10,000 years of solitary confinement, with no contact, no stimulation, and nothing but darkness and silence and the echo of betrayal would have destroyed any sanity that remained. The human mind was not designed for such isolation, and even the enhanced cognition of a space marine had limits that such an existence would inevitably exceed. Rylanor did go mad, in a sense, but his madness took a particular form, a focused obsession that burned away everything else and left only a single purpose. He would have his revenge on Fulgrim. He would make the demon Primarch face him one last time. He would speak the truth that the corrupted lord of the Emperor's children needed to hear. And he would ensure that his gene father felt the sting of his rejection, even if it was the last thing either of them ever experienced. During those endless millennia of waiting, Rylanor planned. His mind, if freed from the demands of combat and survival, worked through every possible scenario, every conceivable approach to the vengeance he sought. He could not chase Fulgrim across the galaxy. He could not fight his way through the Eye of Terror to wherever the demon Primarch had established his pleasure worlds. But he could bring Fulgrim to him, could create a lure that the vain and curious creature would be unable to resist. He studied the sonic weapons that the Noise Marines had used against him, the corrupted technology that served Slanesh's endless hunger for sensation. He analyzed their principles, understood their construction, and adapted what he could salvage to a new purpose. Instead of projecting sound as a weapon, he would use it as a beacon, a signal that would broadcast across the warp itself and touch the minds of those sensitive to such things. The message would be simple, a repetition that would echo through the Imperium until it reached the ears of someone who could not ignore it. And so Rylanor crafted the signal that would change everything, 3 words that would carry the weight of 10 millennia of patient hatred. The Ancient awaits. He set the beacon to broadcast continuously, its signal powered by the same technologies that kept him alive. The psychic scream that had marked the death of Isstvan III's population had long since faded. But now a new sound emerged from that cursed world, a quieter message that nevertheless carried further. It whispered through the currents of the warp, touching the dreams of sorcerers and the calculations of navigators. It spoke of something waiting in the darkness, something old and patient and very, very dangerous. And then Rylanor waited some more. He did not know if his plan would work. He did not know if Fulgrim would hear the beacon, or if the demon Primarch would care enough to investigate. He did not know if he would survive long enough to see his vengeance realized. But he had nothing else, no other purpose, no other reason to continue existing. So he waited, and he hoped, and he held onto his hatred like a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. The centuries passed. The Imperium that Rylanor had helped to build continued its eternal war against the darkness, never knowing that one of its most loyal sons still survived on a world that everyone believed to be empty and dead. Chapters of Space Marines rose and fell. Our campaigns were won and lost, and the galaxy continued its slow descent into the grim darkness that had been prophesied since the dawn of the age of the Imperium. Fulgrim, meanwhile, had ascended to something beyond mortality. The Primarch's corruption had reached its inevitable conclusion during the Horus heresy, his soul consumed by the demon that had lurked within the Leia blade. He had become a demon prince of Slanesh, a serpentine monstrosity of terrible beauty who ruled over pleasure worlds in the Eye of Terror and emerged occasionally to lead the Emperor's children in raids that left entire populations dead or worse. The Primarch had forgotten about Isstvan III. He had forgotten about the loyalists he had ordered killed, at the sons who had remained faithful when he himself had abandoned every principle he once claimed to hold dear. Rylanor was nothing to him now, a footnote in a history that no longer mattered, a name on a list of the dead that had been purged from the Legion's records, along with all other reminders of their shameful origins. But the beacon continued to broadcast, and eventually it caught the attention of someone who had the power to investigate. The Ancient awaits. The final confrontation. 10,000 years after the betrayal, a ship emerged from the warp in the Isstvan system. It was not an Imperial vessel. The hull was covered in sigils that hurt to look at, symbols of power that drew their strength from the realm of chaos itself. The crew were heretic Astartes, Chaos Space Marines who had long ago abandoned their oaths to the Emperor and pledged themselves to darker masters. But they were not Emperor's children. They were Thousand Sons, the Legion of Magnus the Red, and they had come in response to a signal that their master could not ignore. Malin Vistario led the expedition, a sorcerer of considerable power who served Magnus with the same devotion that Rylanor had once shown to the Emperor. With him were two other Chaos Marines, Murshid and Akhtar, both accomplished in the psychic arts that their legion had always cultivated. They had been dispatched to investigate the source of the beacon, to determine what was transmitting the signal and why it had caught the attention of their demon Primarch. The message itself was strange, repetitive, and yet somehow compelling. The Ancient awaits. And it spoke of patience and purpose, of something old and determined waiting in the darkness for something that had not yet come. Magnus had sensed it during one of his meditations, a whisper that cut through the endless noise of the warp and demanded attention. He could not determine its nature from a distance, and so he had sent his servants to learn what they could. The Thousand Sons landed on Isstvan III and found a world that had been dead for 10 millennia. The ruins of cities that had once housed billions stood as monuments to the War Master's fury, their skeletal frameworks slowly crumbling under the weight of ages. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, the radiation having long since decayed to levels that posed no immediate threat to power-armored warriors. That the ash that had covered everything had hardened into a grey crust that cracked beneath their boots as they walked. They followed the signal to its source, descending into catacombs that had survived the bombardment and the passage of time. The walls were scored with the marks of ancient battle, evidence of fighting that had taken place so long ago that the blood had turned to dust. But the beacon grew stronger as they descended, guiding them towards something that waited below. They found him in an underground hangar, exactly where he had been trapped 10,000 years before. The spacecraft that might have been his salvation lay in ruins beside him, its hull breached and its systems long since dead. The bodies of Noise Marines were scattered around him, and their corrupted forms preserved by the dry air and the lack of microorganisms to cause decay. And at the center of it all, slumped against a wall with a virus bomb cradled in his remaining functional arm, was the husk of a contemptor Dreadnought. Vistario approached cautiously, his psychic senses probing the ancient war machine for signs of life or threat. He found both. The Dreadnought's systems were nearly dead, its power reserves down to the absolute minimum required to sustain consciousness. But within that failing shell, something still lived, something that had been waiting for this moment with a patience that defied comprehension. The optical sensors flickered to life, dim red lights that fixed on the approaching sorcerers with an intensity that belied their weakness. And then a voice emerged from speakers that had not been used in millennia, a mechanical rasp that carried undertones of something that might once have been human. I am he who remembers. I am the Ancient of Rites. Vistario recognized the significance immediately. He knew the history of the Horus heresy, knew the story of the Isstvan III atrocity and the loyalists who had been betrayed there. He realized that he was standing before one of the last survivors of that massacre, a warrior whose endurance exceeded anything he had ever encountered or imagined. He tried deception at first, claiming that he and his brothers were loyalists who had come in response to the signal. But Rylanor had spent 10,000 years in solitary contemplation, and his ability to perceive lies had not diminished with his physical capabilities. He knew evasion when he heard it, and he demanded the truth, so Vistario told him. He told him about the Horus heresy and its outcome, about the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, and the Imperium's slow decline into theocracy and stagnation. He told him about the Eye of Terror and the Chaos Legions that dwelt within it, about the Thousand Suns' own fall and their transformation into servants of Tzeentch. He told him about Fulgrim's ascension to daemonhood, about the pleasure worlds where the Daemon Primarch indulged his every perverse whim. And as he spoke, another presence made itself known. The hangar filled with the stench of perfume and the sound of impossible music. Reality itself seemed to ripple and distort, the walls becoming translucent windows into realms of sensation that mortal minds were not meant to perceive. The Thousand Suns fell back, their psychic wards struggling against an intrusion of such power, and through the distortion came a figure of terrible beauty, a serpentine shape that radiated an allure so intense that it hurt to look upon. Fulgrim had heard the beacon after all. The Demon Primarch had been curious about who would dare to call out to him from the dead world where his rebellion had begun, had wanted to see what remained of that ancient history. He had waited for an audience to arrive, had watched through warp-touch senses as the Thousand Suns made their way to the hangar, and now he emerged to face the one who had summoned him, trailing corruption and magnificence in equal measure. The transformation that Fulgrim had undergone since the Horus heresy was complete and terrible. Where once he had been the most beautiful of the Primarchs, a being whose physical perfection was matched only by his grace and charm, now he was something else entirely. His upper body retained some semblance of its former glory, though warped by the touch of chaos into something that was beautiful in the way that a venomous serpent is beautiful. But below the waist, his form had merged into a massive serpentine tail, covered in scales that shimmered with colors that should not exist in the material universe. 4 arms now extended from his torso, each one tipped with claws that dripped with substances best not examined too closely. Wings that seemed to be made of captured dreams and crystallized pleasure sprouted from his back. His face was a mask of seductive malice, promising everything and threatening worse. Well, he was a demon prince of Slaanesh, one of the most powerful entities in the galaxy, and his very presence warped reality around him in ways that would have driven lesser beings insane. The Demon Primarch looked down at the broken Dreadnought with an expression of mingled contempt and fascination. Here was one of his original sons, one of the first generation of Emperor's children, preserved through sheer stubbornness for longer than any of them had any right to exist. Fulgrim could sense the hatred radiating from the ancient warrior, could taste the rage that had kept him alive through 10 millennia of isolation. It was intoxicating. So, he purred, his voice a symphony of seductive harmonies. You have waited all this time just to see me again. I am touched, truly. Tell me, old one, what message have you prepared over these long years? What wisdom do you have to share? Rylanor's response was not words. With the last reserves of power in his failing systems, he hurled the virus bomb directly at Fulgrim's face. The ultimate victory. Time seemed to freeze. The virus bomb arced through the air, its warhead packed with enough life-eater virus to scour the planet clean all over again. If it detonated, everyone in that hangar would die, Chaos Marines and Loyalists alike, their organic matter reduced to slurry by the same weapon that had been meant to kill Rylanor 10,000 years before. The irony was not lost on anyone present. But Fulgrim was not some ordinary enemy, not some mortal commander who could be killed by such crude weapons. He was a demon primarch, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and he had armies of servants at his disposal who existed to protect him from precisely this sort of threat. The Thousand Suns acted on instinct, their psychic powers flaring to life as they conjured a spatial distortion around the falling bomb. The weapon hung suspended in mid-air, its detonation prevented by the bubble of warped space that Vistario and his brothers had created around it. The effort was tremendous, draining them of energy they could not easily replace, but they held the containment field intact because the alternative was death. Fulgrim laughed, the sound like crystal bells being shattered against stone. "Was that your plan, old one?" he asked, genuine amusement coloring his voice. 10,000 years of waiting, And you greet me with a bomb? I am almost disappointed. I expected poetry, philosophy, perhaps a stirring speech about duty and honor. Instead, you give me violence. How pedestrian. Rylanor had no ammunition for his assault cannon, no power for his fist, no weapons left except his voice and his will. But those had always been the true sources of his strength, and they remained intact despite everything that had been done to break him. I have no words for you, traitor, he said, the mechanical rasp of his speakers somehow conveying contempt that transcended mere sound. I have only hatred, and I have had 10,000 years to perfect it. Fulgrim's smile faded slightly, the first hint that his confidence might be misplaced. He had expected the Dreadnought to be broken, physically and mentally, ready to be corrupted or destroyed as the Primarch saw fit. Instead, he found defiance that burned as brightly as it had on the day of the betrayal. The demon Primarch approached the Dreadnought, his serpentine lower body coiling around the ancient war machine in a parody of embrace. His hands, 4 of them now, rather than 2, reached for the seams of the sarcophagus, the armored shell that protected what remained of Rylanor's biological form. "Let me show you what you are missing," Fulgrim whispered, his voice dropping to intimate tones that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. "Let me give you back what was taken from you. I can reshape this flesh, make you beautiful again, whole again. You can walk at my side, not as a crippled relic, but as a perfect warrior, eternal and magnificent. All you have to do is accept me as your master." He began to tear the Dreadnought apart, pulling away armor plates to expose the mechanisms beneath. His claws found the sarcophagus itself, that final shell that contained the remnants of a warrior who had once fought alongside the Emperor. He peeled it open, like a child opening a present, eager to see what lay within. And he found a ruin. Rylanor's body had not been preserved as Fulgrim remembered it. The centuries of stasis had taken their toll, leaving behind a thing of desiccated flesh and failing organs that barely qualified as alive. There was nothing beautiful here, nothing that could be remade into a perfect form. There was only determination given physical shape, the absolute refusal to surrender manifested in meat and bone that should have rotted away millennia ago. Fulgrim pulled the remains from the sarcophagus, cradling them in his arms like a grotesque parody of a mother holding a child. He could remake this, he told himself. His power was sufficient to reshape flesh into any form he desired. He could give Rylanor a new body, could show him the wonders that awaited those who accepted the gifts of the Prince of Pleasure. He could break this stubborn will and add another trophy to his collection. "Join me," he urged, his voice rich with promises that most souls would have found irresistible. "Return to the Legion. Embrace what we have become. I will sculpt you into something beautiful, something perfect. You can be anything you desire, old friend. Anything at all." Rylanor's response echoed through the hangar, broadcast through the failing speakers of his Dreadnought shell, even as his own voice was too weak to carry. "Never. All we have left between us is that we will die together. I am Rylanor of the Emperor's children, ancient of rites, venerable of the Palatine host, and proud servant of the Emperor of mankind, beloved by all. I reject you now and always." The words struck Fulgrim like a physical blow, not because they were loud or powerful, but because they were something he had not experienced in 10,000 years, complete and total rejection. No hedging, no hesitation, no crack of weakness that might be exploited. Just absolute denial from a warrior who had every reason to accept the offer and chose defiance instead. Vistario watched this exchange with emotions he had thought long since purged from his soul. The Thousand Sons had their own complicated relationship with the Chaos Gods, their own history of betrayal and loss. And they served Magnus and through him Tzeentch, but that service was not the same as the mindless devotion that characterized many Chaos worshippers. They remembered what they had been before the Emperor destroyed their world, and some part of them still mourned what they had lost. Seeing Rylanor's defiance stirred something in Vistario that he had not felt in centuries. Here was a warrior who had been abandoned by everything he believed in, who had lost his legion, his primarch, his body, and his hope. He had spent 10,000 years in isolation, with nothing but his hatred for company. And yet when offered the chance to escape that existence, to gain everything a mortal soul could desire, he refused without a moment's hesitation. That was loyalty. That was honor. That was everything the Thousand Sons had once stood for before their fall. Everything they still aspired to in their better moments. And standing opposite that nobility was Fulgrim, a preening monster who thought he could break anyone's will simply because his own had shattered so easily. Vistario made a decision. "He deserves better than you," he said to Fulgrim, his voice carrying an edge that made the Daemon Primarch's eyes narrow. "He deserves better than any of us." And then he drew his bolt pistol and shot one of his own brothers through the head. The spatial distortion collapsed instantly. Without all three sorcerers maintaining it, the containment field could not hold. The virus bomb fell the remaining distance to the ground, and its warhead detonated with a sound like a whispered promise. The Life Eater spread through the hangar in a microsecond, consuming everything organic in its path. Vistario died first, his body dissolving even as a smile crossed his face. His remaining brother followed an instant later, flesh and bone reduced to the same putrid sludge that had covered Isstvan III 10,000 years before. The decayed remnants of the Noise Marines that Rylanor had killed so long ago finally completed their dissolution, becoming nothing more than stains on the ancient stone. Rylanor died as well, his ruined flesh no match for the virus that had been meant to kill him all those years ago. But he died defiant, died free, died having accomplished what he had set out to do. He had faced Fulgrim one last time, and he had won. Fulgrim did not die. Demon Primarchs cannot truly be killed by physical means, their essences tied to the warp in ways that transcend the limitations of matter and energy. But as the Life Eater consumed everything around him, as the words of Rylanor's rejection echoed in his mind, he felt something he had not experienced since before his corruption. He felt pain, not physical pain, for his demonic form was immune to such mundane concerns, but emotional pain, spiritual pain, the agony of having his pride wounded by a crippled relic that should have been beneath his notice. Rylanor's final words were burned into his consciousness, a brand that no amount of pleasure or sensation could ever erase. "I reject you now and always." Slaanesh thrives on sensation, on experience, on the endless pursuit of newer and more intense stimuli. To be denied, to be rejected, to be told that you are not worthy of someone's acceptance. This was anathema to everything that Fulgrim had become. The demon within him recoiled from the wound that Rylanor had inflicted, unable to process a pain that had no corresponding pleasure to balance it. And Vistario's words added salt to that wound. "He deserves better than you." A chaos sorcerer, a servant of Tzeentch, had looked at Fulgrim and found him wanting compared to a corpse in a metal box. The humiliation was complete, the rejection absolute. Fulgrim fled the planet, vanishing back into the warp with a scream of frustrated fury. Behind him, Isstvan III underwent its second virus bombing, its surface once again scoured clean of all organic matter. The hangar where Rylanor had waited for so long was filled with the residue of dissolution, the chemical evidence of lives that had ended in that final confrontation. But the message lingered. The Ancient awaits. Even now, even after everything, those words continue to whisper through the warp, a testament to the will of a warrior who refused to be broken by 10,000 years of isolation and suffering. Legacy and remembrance. Rylanor did not win in the traditional sense. He did not kill Fulgrim, did not end the Daemon Primarch's existence, did not strike a blow that changed the balance of power in the eternal war between order and chaos. By any military metric, his final action was a failure, a sacrifice that accomplished nothing of strategic value. But there are victories that transcend the battlefield, achievements that cannot be measured in bodies counted or territories conquered. Rylanor's triumph was of this kind, a victory of the spirit rather than the flesh. a demonstration that some things are more powerful than even the gods of chaos. Consider for a moment what Rylanor faced in that final confrontation. Before him stood a being who had once been his genetic father, the source of everything that made him an emperor's child. Fulgrim was not just an enemy, but the embodiment of everything Rylanor had loved and lost. Every memory of glory, every moment of brotherhood, every triumph that the Emperor's children had ever achieved was connected to the creature that now demanded his submission. Chaos offers its servants everything they desire: power beyond imagination, pleasure without limit, freedom from the constraints of mortality and morality alike. For a warrior who had spent 10,000 years in isolation, who had been broken and trapped and abandoned, the temptation must have been almost unimaginable. Fulgrim was offering him release from suffering, a restoration of his body, a return to something approaching life. All he had to do was bend the knee to the being who had destroyed everything he loved. And Rylanor refused, not with hesitation or regret, not with a heavy heart or a troubled conscience. He refused absolutely, completely, with every fiber of his being. He chose death over submission, destruction over corruption, loyalty over survival. In doing so, he proved something that the forces of chaos had sought to disprove since the dawn of their existence: that the human spirit cannot be broken by suffering alone, that loyalty based on principle rather than self-interest can endure anything. He proved that corruption is not inevitable. The Emperor's children fell, transformed from the noblest of legions into the most depraved. Yet their Primarch abandoned every principle he had once claimed to hold dear, surrendering himself to powers that promised pleasure without end. Warrior after warrior followed Fulgrim into damnation, their souls consumed by the very pursuit of perfection that had once made them great. But Rylanor did not fall. Despite being a product of that same legion, despite being shaped by that same culture of perfectionism and excellence, he remained true to his oaths. Not through ignorance of what chaos offered, not through weakness that made him unable to accept corruption, but through a conscious choice to remain loyal to what he believed was right. He proved that free will exists even in a universe where gods fight for dominion over mortal souls. He proved that loyalty endures. 10,000 years is a length of time that defies human comprehension. Civilizations rise and fall in less time than Rylanor spent waiting in his underground prison. The Imperium that he had helped to build transformed beyond recognition during his vigil, becoming a theocracy that would have horrified the Emperor he had known. Everything he had believed in was corrupted or destroyed, and yet his loyalty remained intact. He did not serve the Emperor because he expected reward or feared punishment. He served because service was the right thing to do, because loyalty was its own justification, because some commitments are too sacred to be abandoned, even when everything else has been taken away. He proved that defiance matters. Fulgrim is a being of immense power, a demon Primarch whose very presence warps reality and whose will can reshape the fates of worlds. By any rational calculation, so opposing him is pointless, a gesture that cannot hope to accomplish anything against such overwhelming might. But Rylanor's defiance was not about calculation. It was about meaning, about the statement that some things are worth standing against, even when standing is all you can do. His rejection of Fulgrim's offer was not just a personal choice, but a declaration that the values of the Imperium still had power, that the corruption of chaos had not consumed everything it touched. Perhaps most remarkably, he proved that redemption is possible. Vistario and his fellow Thousand Sons were Chaos Marines, servants of dark gods who had abandoned the Imperium 10,000 years before. They had no reason to help Rylanor, no obligation to sacrifice themselves for a loyalist they had never met. And yet in that final moment, so watching the Ancient of Rites reject everything chaos had to offer, they made a choice. They chose honor over survival. They chose to give Rylanor his victory rather than preserve their own lives. They betrayed their current masters to serve the ideals they had abandoned so long ago. In doing so, they proved that even those who have fallen can find their way back, that the light of the Emperor can still touch souls that have dwelt in darkness for millennia. This is the legacy of Rylanor the Unyielding. Not the battles he won during the Great Crusade, not the traditions he maintained as ancient of rites, not even the desperate stand at Isstvan III. His true legacy is the proof that loyalty, honor, and defiance can survive anything, that the human spirit cannot be broken by mere isolation or suffering, that some choices are so powerful they can echo through 10,000 years and beyond. There is a lesson here for all of us. Whether we serve the Emperor in the far future or simply navigate the challenges of our own lives in the present day. Rylanor teaches us that integrity matters, that standing firm in our principles is not just morally correct, but practically powerful. He teaches us that the choices we make in our darkest moments define us more than any triumph in our brightest. He teaches us that true loyalty is not about convenience or reward, but about commitment to something larger than ourselves. The forces of chaos would have us believe that everyone has a breaking point, that every soul can be corrupted if sufficient pressure is applied. They point to the fall of the Primarchs as evidence, into the countless mortals and Astartes who have bent the knee to the dark gods over the millennia, and in many cases, they are right. The galaxy is full of beings who started with noble intentions and ended as slaves to corruption. But Rylanor proves that this is not inevitable. He proves that the choice remains, even when everything else has been stripped away. He proves that a single soul, standing firm against impossible odds, can achieve a victory that armies cannot. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, this message is perhaps the most precious gift that anyone could give. It tells us that even in the worst circumstances, even when everything seems lost, there is still a choice to be made. We can surrender to the darkness, or we can stand against it with whatever strength we have left. Our Rylanor chose to stand, and in standing, he became eternal. So ends the tale of the Ancient of Rites, the last loyal son of the Emperor's children, the warrior who waited 10,000 years for his revenge and achieved something far more important than mere vengeance. His body is gone now, consumed by the same weapon that was meant to kill him so long ago. His Dreadnought shell is silent, its systems finally allowed to rest after millennia of stubborn endurance. But his spirit lives on in everyone who hears his story and takes inspiration from his example. He lives on in the warriors who face impossible odds and refuse to give in. He lives on in the loyal servants of the Imperium who maintain their faith despite everything that seeks to corrupt them. He lives on in every soul that chooses honor over expedience, duty over pleasure, or loyalty over self-interest. The Ancient awaits, and perhaps, in some way, he always will. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the most powerful stories in Warhammer 40,000 lore, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps create more content, exploring the incredible depth of this universe, the heroes who fight within it, and the lessons their stories have to teach us. Until next time, may your faith be as unshakable as Rylanor's, and may your loyalty endure through whatever darkness lies ahead. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.